I had always thought pregnancy would be a time of joy, excitement, and anticipation. That's what everyone told me, right? People would gush about how amazing it was, how a child would complete a family. But standing in that bathroom, staring at the little stick in my hand, I felt nothing but uncertainty. A mix of emotions swirled inside me: confusion, fear, guilt. I wasn't sure what to feel. When I told James, he didn't react the way I expected. He wasn't jumping for joy, didn't hug me or smile. No, instead, he just stared at the stick in my hand as if it were a ticking time bomb. I should have known then, something wasn't right. He cleared his throat awkwardly and finally said, "Are you sure?" I remember how that question hit me like a slap. Sure. Of course, I was sure. I was the one who had taken the test, the one who had been feeling nauseous for weeks, the one who had been late. But there he was, standing in front of me with that puzzled, uncomfortable look on his face. It was like the air between us had thickened, becoming so dense I could barely breathe. "Yeah, I'm sure, James," I snapped, the edge in my voice surprising even me. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just nodded slowly, then let out a long sigh and muttered, "We'll need to talk about this later." Later? What the hell did that even mean? I wanted to scream at him right there, but instead, I kept quiet. I knew something was off. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't happy either. It was almost as if he was distant. And I hated that. He had been distant for months, but I'd convinced myself that things would be fine. I told myself we'd work through it, that things would go back to normal once we settled down. But now, standing there, I realized that I had been wrong. James was pulling away, even more so than before. That night, we didn't talk much. The tension hung between us like a thick fog. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. What was going on? Why hadn't he been thrilled? Wasn't this supposed to be a happy moment? Shouldn't we have been planning for a future together? Instead, I lay awake, feeling more alone than I had in months. The next morning, James barely looked at me. It was as if we had gone from being partners in this to being strangers. I had expected him to ask about what we'd do next, whether we'd keep the baby, how we'd handle it all. But no, he didn't ask any of those things. Instead, he just turned to me and said, "I need you to be honest with me." My stomach dropped. Honest? About what? "I need a paternity test," he said, his words slicing through the air. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A paternity test? What was wrong with him? How could he even suggest something like that after all we'd been through together? After everything, now he was doubting me? I let out a laugh, but it was bitter, harsh, a nervous chuckle that didn't feel right. "You're joking, right?" I said, trying to mask the anger that was building inside me. "I thought you would at least trust me, James. Are you seriously asking for a paternity test?" But he didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. His face was dead serious, his jaw set in that stubborn way I had come to hate over the years. "I'm not saying I don't trust you," he said slowly, as if every word weighed a ton. "But I can't be sure. I've got my doubts." Doubts. The word echoed in my mind. Doubts about me? Doubts about us? What had I done to deserve this? I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he was being ridiculous, that we had been through so much together. But the truth was, I had no right to act surprised. I'd been cheating on him for months with someone else, someone who had made me feel alive again when James had started pulling away. I had to admit, deep down, that I had contributed to the cracks in our relationship. I had made this mess. Still, the suggestion of a paternity test stung more than I could have ever anticipated. In my mind, I kept thinking, is this how he sees me? As someone capable of such a betrayal? I'll get the test done, I said quietly, unable to meet his eyes. The words tasted like acid in my mouth. James didn't say anything else. He turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next few days felt like an eternity. James and I barely spoke. Every time I looked at him, it was as if a wall had been built between us, an unbreachable wall of distrust, confusion, and hurt. I didn't know what was worse, the silence or the fact that I had to face the truth that James might never forgive me. That our relationship, once full of laughter and late-night conversations, was now in shambles because of my mistakes. I went to the doctor to confirm the pregnancy. The test results came back positive, just as I had known they would. But this time, they felt like a burden. I wasn't sure I wanted to carry the weight of this baby on my own, and I wasn't sure I could handle the mess I'd made. And then, the phone call came. James wanted to meet. I wasn't sure whether to feel hope or dread. What did he want? Was he coming to apologize? Was he finally ready to talk about what had happened between us? Or had he already made up his mind to walk away? All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The day of the paternity test, I could feel the tension in my chest, tight and suffocating. I had no idea what to expect, but something about it felt final. This test, these results, they would decide everything. I had never realized how much a small piece of paper could hold so much weight. For the first time in weeks, I thought about what it would mean if the test came back positive, if the baby was James's. And if it wasn't? I had to face the uncomfortable truth, I had made a mistake. A huge one. The affair. The lies. The guilt had been gnawing at me for months, but now, it felt like it had caught up with me. I could see James's face every time I closed my eyes, his expression when he first found out about the pregnancy, the look in his eyes when he asked for that paternity test. He wasn't angry, not in the way I expected. No, James was uncertain. His doubt had cut deeper than any anger could. The morning of the test, we barely spoke. James had his coat on, his face unreadable, and I was just numb. There was nothing left to say. He had his doubts, and I had betrayed him. I could feel it in every inch of my being, the weight of that betrayal. The entire relationship had been a lie, a fragile thing built on uncertainty. I thought about telling him everything. I thought about confessing everything I had done. But then I wondered, what would that accomplish? Would it make anything better? Would it make him stay? We arrived at the clinic in silence. I sat in the waiting room, staring at the sterile white walls, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I couldn't bring myself to look at James, who sat across from me, his face as stiff as the chair he sat in. He was a stranger to me now. I could almost feel the seconds ticking by in that room, each one louder than the last. I didn't know what to do with myself. I had never felt more alone in my life. It was the strangest thing, sitting there next to the person I thought I knew, but now, we were strangers. He hadn't said a word to me since we walked in, and I hadn't pushed it. What was there to say? Emily, James's voice broke the silence. His tone was hesitant, unsure. We need to talk about this, about us. I looked up at him, my stomach dropping. What do you mean? We're here. This is what you wanted, right? His eyes flickered away for a second, and I could see the pain in them. I know what I said, but I'm not sure I'm ready for this. I need answers before we go any further. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just doubting the baby, he was doubting me. He was doubting everything we had been, everything we had built. My heart sank, and I felt a pang of guilt deep inside. He had every right to question me. I had made it easy for him to doubt. When the test was over, and we were told the results would take a couple of days, it felt like an eternity. Those few days stretched out into something unbearable. I couldn't look at James without feeling that weight, the elephant in the room that neither of us wanted to address. The silence between us was deafening. I spent those days replaying everything. Our relationship had always been complicated, but it had always felt worth it. Or at least, I had convinced myself it was. We had our issues, sure. But who didn't? People argued. People fought. But we always came back together. That's how I saw it, anyway. But now, I saw how fragile it all was. How fragile I had been. I kept thinking about the affair. About the other man. I didn't want to admit it, but he had filled a void that James couldn't, or wouldn't, fill. I never meant for it to happen, but I had sought out something outside of our relationship. Something that made me feel alive again. Something that made me feel wanted. And now, looking at James, I felt nothing but shame. The day the test results came in, my hands shook as I picked up the phone. James was with me, standing in the kitchen, his eyes on me, waiting. I wasn't sure what I wanted, what I was hoping for. Part of me wanted the test to say the baby was his, to fix everything, to give us a chance to move forward. But another part of me feared the truth, the part of me that knew the child might not be his. When I dialed the clinic, my breath caught in my throat as they answered. They said they had the results. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I listened to the nurse's voice on the other end. "Ms. Walker," she said, "the results are in." I closed my eyes, clutching the phone like it might slip from my hands. "What do they say?" I barely whispered the words. There was a pause before she spoke again. "The baby is not Mr. James's child." I felt the world tilt beneath me. I wanted to scream, to say something, but the words were stuck in my throat. I glanced at James, who stood there, his face draining of color. The room was silent. The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, choking us both. James turned away from me, his back stiff, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fix this. How could I? The damage had been done. James's voice, low and cold, broke through the silence. I knew it. Those 3 words cut deeper than I could have imagined. They weren't angry words, not like I expected. No, they were words of defeat, words that told me he had known for some time that something was wrong, that something was broken between us. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. James didn't look at me. Instead, he grabbed his coat from the chair and pulled it on, his movements mechanical. "I need space, Emily." I stood there, frozen, as he walked out of the door, leaving me with the weight of his absence pressing down on me. The test result was out, but the truth had been revealed long before. The silence in the house was suffocating. After James left, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the quiet hum of my thoughts. I stood by the door for a moment, staring at the spot where he had stood just seconds ago. I heard the slam of the front door as he left, the sound still echoing in my ears like a gunshot. I didn't know what to do with myself. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I had never felt more alone than I did in that moment, standing in the middle of our empty living room, staring at the place where our life had been. I had expected this, in a way. I knew the consequences of my actions, knew that the fragile trust we had built was now shattered. But nothing could have prepared me for the emptiness that followed. I ran my fingers through my hair and sat down on the couch, my thoughts racing. What now? What was I supposed to do with this mess I had made? I could hear the baby kicking inside me, feel the tiny life growing within me, but the reality of what had happened hit me hard. The guilt weighed on me like a heavy stone. How could I have let things go this far? How could I have been so careless, so selfish? I thought about James, about how he had always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. He was always patient, always forgiving. But I had pushed him away. I had driven him to the point where he couldn't even trust me anymore. The affair had seemed like a way out at the time. I had convinced myself that I was justified, that I needed something for myself, that I wasn't being seen, that I wasn't being heard. But now, in the quiet aftermath, I realized how foolish I had been. How could I have thought any of it was worth it? How could I have thought that betraying James, betraying our relationship, could ever bring me peace? I wanted to reach out to him, wanted to call him, tell him how sorry I was, tell him I'd do anything to fix this. But I knew it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't change anything. He had made up his mind. And the truth was, deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted to fix it anyway. What would it take? Would he ever look at me the same way again? Would he ever be able to forgive me for the lies, for the betrayal, for everything I had done? I stood up abruptly, feeling a wave of frustration flood over me. I couldn't stay here, not in this house, not in this life I had ruined. But where would I go? What would I do? The questions spun in my mind, too many to answer, too many to even consider. The baby kicked again, as if reminding me that I wasn't entirely alone, that there was still someone, I had to take care of. The thought made me pause. I had made a mess of everything, yes, but I couldn't let it consume me. I couldn't let my mistakes destroy the only thing that was still pure, still untouched by the chaos I had caused. I left the house that afternoon, the air outside colder than I expected, as if the world itself was mirroring the chill inside me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to get away. The weight of everything was pressing down on me, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I needed space. I walked aimlessly, through the park near our neighborhood, past families and couples enjoying their afternoon. They seemed so happy, so unaware of the mess I was living through. I couldn't help but envy them, envy their simple lives, their simplicity. I wanted that. I wanted a life where I didn't have to carry this burden, where I didn't have to deal with the guilt and the shame. But that wasn't my reality anymore. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the sun began to set, I found myself outside the coffee shop where I had met him. The man I had been with. The man who had given me the attention I craved when James had stopped looking at me the way I wanted. He had been a mistake, a way to escape from my own insecurities, from the crumbling relationship I hadn't known how to fix. But now, standing outside that coffee shop, I realized how foolish I had been. I could have stayed with James. I could have fixed things, worked through the problems. But instead, I had chosen this, and now I had to live with it. I walked away from the coffee shop and down the street, my thoughts swirling, my emotions in turmoil. I didn't want to think about the affair anymore, didn't want to think about the man or the lies or the consequences. I just wanted to be done with it. I wanted to move on, but how could I? How could I move on when I was carrying the consequences of my actions, carrying a baby that wasn't even James's? As the days passed, I found myself in a routine. It wasn't a good routine, but it was a routine nonetheless. I woke up each morning, went through the motions of life, and tried to ignore the fact that everything around me was falling apart. I didn't know what I was doing anymore, didn't know how to move forward, but I knew I couldn't keep living in the space of guilt and regret. One evening, as I sat on the couch, I found myself reaching for my phone. I didn't know why. Maybe I was hoping for some kind of sign, some kind of message from James. Maybe I was hoping he would call, that he would apologize, that he would tell me everything would be okay. But as I stared at the screen, I realized something. He wasn't coming back. He had moved on. And I had to do the same. The baby kicked again, and I placed my hand over my stomach, feeling the tiny life inside me. I may have made a mess of everything, but this child was mine. I had to find a way to take care of this new life, to do something right for once. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had to stop dwelling on the past. I had to focus on the present, on the child who would need me. Because, at the end of the day, I was the only one who could fix this. The weeks dragged on, each one a blur of passing time and unspoken emotions. I had accepted the fact that James and I were over, that we were never going to be the couple we once were. He was gone, and no matter how much I wished things could be different, I couldn't change that. I spent my days in a haze, going through the motions of life, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine, even though deep down, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I had started going to prenatal appointments on my own, getting used to the idea of raising this baby without James. I'd even started picking out baby clothes, tiny onesies and blankets, things that seemed so insignificant yet so important at the same time. There was no joy in it, no excitement. Just emptiness. But I couldn't ignore the life growing inside me. No matter what had happened between James and me, this child was still mine, and I had to take care of it. The loneliness was suffocating, but I had no one to blame but myself. I had made choices that had led me to this place. And though part of me wanted to blame James for leaving, for not being there, I knew the truth. I had pushed him away. I had caused this, and I had to live with the consequences. One evening, I sat on the couch, staring at the baby's ultrasound pictures on the coffee table. The little life inside me, growing every day. I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt wash over me. I had promised myself that I would never put a child in this position, but here I was, bringing a baby into a world of broken promises and shattered dreams. The sound of my phone buzzing on the coffee table broke through my thoughts. It was a message from James. I hadn't heard from him in weeks, not since the day the paternity test results had come back. I hesitated before opening the message, unsure of what to expect. Part of me wanted to hear from him, wanted him to reach out, but another part of me was afraid of what he might say. "I've been thinking a lot lately," the message began. "I know things between us have been difficult, and I can't pretend that I haven't been hurt. But I also know that what happened wasn't just one person's fault. I've made mistakes too. And I don't expect us to go back to how we were, but I think we need to talk." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, reading the message over and over again. What did he mean? Did this mean he was willing to try again? Was he offering some kind of closure, or was this just another false hope? I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, wanted to tell him everything I had been feeling, to apologize for what I had done. But another part of me wasn't sure if I was ready. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go back to the person I had been when we were together, the person who had made so many mistakes. I waited until the next day to reply. I had spent the night tossing and turning, trying to sort through my emotions. What did I want from him? What did I want for myself? I had to stop living in the past, stop holding on to something that was already gone. "James, I don't know what to say," I wrote. "I'm sorry for everything that happened. I know I can't change the past, but I want to move forward, for the sake of this baby. I just need to focus on what's next. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. I didn't need to explain everything, didn't need to tell him all the ways I had messed up. I had already said enough. The response came later that evening. I understand. I think we both need to move on. But I'm still here for you, Emily. You don't have to do this alone. I felt a mix of relief and sadness wash over me. It was the closure I had needed, the acknowledgement that James wasn't coming back, but that he was still willing to be a part of my life in some small way. It was a bittersweet relief, but it was enough. I put my phone down and stared out the window, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone anymore. I had made a choice. I had chosen to move forward, to raise this baby on my own. I wasn't going to let my mistakes define me. I wasn't going to let the past dictate my future. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be days when I would wonder if I had made the right decision, if I had done enough to fix things with James. But I knew, deep down, that I had to make the best of what I had now. I had to focus on this child, on the future I was building, even if it wasn't the one I had imagined. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I went to my appointments, took care of myself, and slowly began to prepare for the baby's arrival. It was strange, preparing for a life I wasn't sure I was ready for, but I was determined to make it work. I didn't need James to be a part of this anymore. I didn't need anyone. I had myself, and that was enough. The day the baby was born was the day everything changed. I had made it through the hardest part, the part where I had to face my mistakes and accept the consequences. But this was the beginning of something new. Something I could build, something I could make better. I held the baby in my arms for the first time, feeling the warmth of a tiny hand wrapping around my finger. In that moment, all the pain, all the regret, all the lost chances faded into the background. This was my new beginning. I was no longer the person who had made those mistakes. I was someone new, someone who had learned from the past and was determined to move forward. I wasn't going to let my mistakes define me anymore. I was going to give this child everything I had, everything I could. And as I looked down at my baby, I knew that this was the life I was meant to have.